The honourable member for Mission, Matsqui, Fraser Canyon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll be splitting my time with the members from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes. Sustainable Development Canada was launched in 2000. Sustainable Technology Development Canada was launched in 2001 to support businesses to innovate and create new sustainable technologies. For more than a decade, and under both Liberal and Conservative governments, SDTC had a few problems, but nothing major until this Prime Minister took office. In 2016, the Liberals changed the process for appointments, claiming it would be open and transparent. In 2019, the Liberals were frustrated with then-Chair Jim Basili, who had spoken out against government legislation and decided he should be removed and replaced. The former Minister of Industry, Navdeep Bains, proposed two options for Mr. Basili's replacement. One of them was Annette Verscharen, an entrepreneur who had been receiving SDTC funding through one of her companies. There was a clear conflict of interest with Ms. Verscharen, so you think with this new and open, transparent appointment process, Ms. Verscharen would have been disqualified immediately. But you think wrong. Former Minister Bains, ignoring several warnings about her conflict of interest, proceeded with the appointment within 3 weeks of Mr. Basili's removal. With the arrival of Ms. Verscharen at SDTC, an environment was created in which conflicts of interest were tolerated and managed by the board. Board members would go on to award SDTC funding to companies in which they held stock or positions. Minister Bains appointed 5 more of the board members who engaged in unethical and illegal behavior by approving funding to companies in which they held ownership or seats on the board. Officials from the Department of Industry, Science and Economic Development sat on the board as observers and witnessed 96 conflicts of interest but did not intervene. Former Minister Bains would be replaced in January 2021 by the current minister, and in November 2022, whistleblowers began raising internal concerns with the Auditor General about the unethical practices at SDTC. In February 2023, the Privy Council was briefed by whistleblowers and commissioned 2 independent reports. In September of last year, the allegations became public, but it took the industry minister a month to agree to suspend funding to the organization. In November, the Auditor General announced they would be conducting an audit of SDTC. And that brings us to this week, with the damning report outlining how $123 million of taxpayer money was misappropriated and misused by this board. The Auditor General's report, which I might add is one of the most damning I have ever seen in my adult life, way worse than the sponsorship scandal of the 1990s, I will add, outlined that SDTC did not follow conflict of interest policies in 90 cases. It outlined that $76 million on projects connected to Friends of the Liberals who sat on the board. It outlined that SDTC spent $59 million on projects that were not allowed to have been awarded any money. It outlined that SDTC spent $12 million on projects that were both in a conflict of interest and ineligible for funding. And in one case, Ms. Verscharen siphoned off $217,000 to her own company. The report makes clear that this scandal falls squarely on the shoulders of this government, this current minister, who did not sufficiently monitor the contracts that were given to Liberal insiders. At last night's industry committee meeting, the government was quick to gloat over how many clean tech projects have benefited from SDTC. But when witnesses were questioned at committee last night, they failed to admit to the corrupt nature regarding the funding and conflict of interest of these projects. My colleague questioned the witnesses who were responsible for making appointments, yet the SDTC communications manager failed to take any responsibility for the conflict of interest cases. We continue to ask officials on how decisions and appointments were made, but time and time again, this government failed to take responsibility for its corrupt practices and pointed to broad administrative processes which had no bearing on the questions taxpayers were demanding be answered. It seemed as though the whole team was working, had amnesia, and they failed to provide the committee with answers on how these decisions were made or the relationship to the Auditor General's report. So I'll ask this question again that my colleagues asked last night to the Liberal government, that nobody really knew what was going on. Nobody had any involvement in the appointments process. The government was completely guilt-free of anything that happened. Maybe today we can get some answers from Liberal members about what they did wrong and how they're going to fix it. When questioned on whether Minister Baines, the former minister, had read the Auditor General's report, he couldn't even say he had. It is absurd that a former minister and current vice president at Rogers Communications wouldn't take the time to read such an important report before coming to committee. You know, Madam Speaker, it's hard not to feel disappointed in your government when every day there is just a new scandal. In 2015, the Liberals promised to be open and transparent, the most open and transparent government in the Canadian history. Very quickly, Canadians have learned that that's not the case. We saw in 2019 when the Prime Minister pressured former Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould to get a get-out-of-jail-free card to the corrupt SNC-Lavalin, and he fired her for refusing to do it. We saw again in 2020 when the Prime Minister granted hundreds of millions of dollars to We Charity, an organization his family had financially benefited from, and then prorogued Parliament to shut down the investigation and avoid accountability. We saw again in 2022 when we first started to hear of foreign interference in Canada's democracy, which the Liberals continue to cover up. This week, we asked numerous times to name the MPs who were involved, and they refused to do so. After 9 years, Canadians know they will not get any transparency or accountability out of this government. At this point, Canadians have so many scandals before them that in fact they're becoming numb to how bad things really are. They are no longer able to expect the government to be open and honest with them or take responsibility for their actions, which should be the bare minimum expectation for any government. We continue to allow this government, we cannot continue to let this government get away with this level of corruption. More than $100 million handed out to Liberal insiders with clear conflict of interest. So the Conservative Party today is calling upon Parliament to get the requisite documents, to get to the bottom at what happened at SDTC, to get to the bottom of how taxpayer dollars were misappropriated in such a clear and deliberate way. Canadians don't have a lot of trust left in our institutions. I'm hoping the Liberals will vote with the Conservatives today and allow Parliament to access the information that we're seeking to give Canadians and the RCMP and our law enforcement the clear tools that they need to hold people accountable so Canadian taxpayers know where their money is being spent and how it is being used. Again, I'll just point out, at last night's Industry Committee, it was one of the most disappointing displays I have ever had in my close to 5 years in this House now. They clearly could not answer any single question. They clearly did not want to answer any single question. It was delay and obfuscation at a level I have never seen before. Parliament needs to know how Canada's money was spent. Parliament needs to know that this will not happen again, and Canadians need to be assured that we will not waste their taxpayer dollars like this ever again. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. SDTC, the issue at the side, putting to the side right now, does in fact, over the last 20 years, provide all sorts of opportunities for companies across the country in terms of whether it's startups to expand, that create green jobs, that allow Canadian companies to be leaders in the world in technology. And we recognize that it was important to see the board dissolved and ultimately transfer over into NRC. I'm wondering if the member has any thoughts in regards to NRC taking over the responsibilities, ensuring that we can continue to provide the funds that are necessary for our environment.
The honourable member for Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the first part of the member's question, the big scandal here is that this government has let down small businesses. This government has let down the innovative sector in Canada. This government has discredited startups in this country that legitimately rely on SDTC to bring their technologies to market, to commercialize new and innovative technologies that will protect our government. What we see here today is a clear case of administrative injustice at a level we have not seen very often in the history of our country. This Auditor General report is like nothing I have ever read. Case upon case of this government clearly allowing for conflict of interest cases to go through, for insiders to have money in their pocket at the expense of Canadian companies that deserve so much more. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Saint-Jean.
The honourable member for Saint-Jean. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. We've seen the AG reports, and one of them was about McKinsey. We know that the government subcontracted, and that led to a loss of expertise in the public service. Same thing here with SDTC. We don't know where some of these workers are going to end up. They had expertise in sustainability, and we may lose more of that knowledge within the public service. I'd like to hear from my colleague, in a general way, whether we should be supporting the public service more and stop delegating in order to keep expertise within the public service.
Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member for her question. I think in respect to the workers at play here, it was the former Conservative government that brought in stronger enforcement for whistleblowers. We need to protect members of the public service that see an injustice and are willing to stand up for Canadian taxpayers, and in this case, we really did see that. So while we did see a level of incompetence and disregard for public money at Industry Canada and at SDTC, the positive thing is that there were public servants and officials willing to step up to protect Canadian interests. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I had a lot of confidence when we came into this Parliament that we would get serious about the climate crisis. Canada has the ability and the leadership to have a clean energy economy, yet we're still waiting on the investment tax credits long after the Deputy Prime Minister promised them. We're seeing green slush funds, and yet all the while, this government focused on giving $34 billion in taxpayers' money to build a pipeline for Pathways Alliance. They never blinked once when it came to building that pipeline, but yet when it came to putting the solutions on the ground for a clean tech economy, they were more willing to help their friends than to live up to their obligations that the Prime Minister made as a solemn promise to the Canadian people back in 2015.
The honourable member for Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Well, I'd like to thank the member for his question. The debate today is not about pipelines, although I'm very pleased to see the Kinder Morgan pipeline completed. I think that's going to do a lot of good for the Canadian taxpayers. I'm glad that project's finished. But what we're talking about here today, Madam Speaker, is a very serious issue. An Auditor General's report that clearly outlines clear cases of a conflict of interest. What this report outlines is that this government failed in their duties to the Canadian public to administer public funds in both a transparent and way that Canadians would expect from their officials. Thank you, Madam Speaker.